All right, welcome to chapter 3. I'm out in the bosque again, obviously, over by Alameda Bridge on the west side. And this is one of my favorite spots because it's not super crowded. So let's talk about chapter 3. It's all about ecology, ecosystems, how they function, and how sort of energy and matter move within and throughout and across and beyond an ecosystem. So you've probably heard of the Earth spheres in biology class a while back. There's the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere. Those are the four main ones. There are actually two more that I like to sort of think about. I don't usually consider them to be, fundamental concepts that you need to understand, but people are talking about them, and I think if you sort of extrapolate beyond each of the other spheres, you sort of have a subsphere of the hydrosphere in the form of the cryosphere, or the ice that is on Earth, since the Earth is very much dominated by processes involving ice, both melting and forming, and what they do to sort of regulate Earth's climate. And then sort of a subsystem, a subsphere of the biosphere. Some scientists describe the anthrosphere, or those aspects of the Earth system that are influenced by human beings, anthro being man. Now, we'll dive into all of this a little bit more, but on this first slide that talks also about sort of these three components that support life on Earth, and that's solar energy passing through the biosphere, passing from the sun to producers in the form of plants and other photosynthetic organisms, and then in through all of the food webs and food chains up through and beyond, and then decomposing and sort of starting anew. And that decomposition process sort of also relates to the cycling of both matter and energy within and beyond the biosphere. So one example of that is carbon dioxide moving from the atmosphere into the biosphere through photosynthesis. Another example is minerals moving from the lithosphere into plants through the absorption of nutrients from soil. Another example is human beings in either the biosphere, the anthrosphere, adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere or adding pollution to the hydrosphere. So they're all connected, and that all those processes interacting is a fundamental component of life on Earth. And then lastly, sort of oddly, although obviously, is gravity. And the fact that gravity keeps the atmosphere dense towards the Earth's surface, and that allows life, especially complex life, to develop on the Earth's surface. So let's move on to a little more of a discussion of each of those spheres. So obviously the atmosphere is one that we're familiar with in that form, in that name, more so than probably some of the other sphere names. The two aspects of the atmosphere that you need to be aware of are just the two layers closest to the Earth. At the Earth's surface, we have the troposphere, which is where all the weather happens and where humans live and most of the biosphere exists. And then directly above that, we have the stratosphere. Now, not a lot happens in the stratosphere, but it does contain a very tiny layer of material that without it, we wouldn't have complex life on the Earth's surface. Probably the most complex thing on the Earth's surface would be plants and insects. Without the ozone layer, which is in the stratosphere, it's just a layer of O3 molecules, we wouldn't have complex life. Without the ozone layer, we wouldn't have amphibians, wouldn't have therefore reptiles, mammals, primates, and humans. So all of those components of the atmosphere are essential, and those are the two main aspects of the atmosphere that you need to be aware of. Then we have the hydrosphere, which is all the water. Now, ice is typically factored into this, but if you want to be fancy, you can call ice its own sphere, the cryosphere. But all the water processes, from erosion to water moving from rain through precipitation down into rivers, down to the ocean, and then evaporation, is all part of the hydrologic cycle, which you'll learn more about later. But it's all part of that hydrosphere. Then we have the lithosphere, all the earth processes that relate to the earth itself: rock, minerals, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, weathering and erosion. All of those things occur within the lithosphere. And then we have, of course, the biosphere, all the life that can be found on Earth's surface. And all these things interact with one another. So one example of that would be microbial communities of single-celled organisms that live in the soil actually are a pretty important component of water purification. So as water moves through the soil, these microorganisms clean the water, which allow us to drink it without as much processing. Another example of the sort of spheres interacting, I already mentioned the biosphere extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turning it into glucose through photosynthesis, but actually adding CO2 back into the atmosphere through things like cellular respiration. And those are all ways by which many of these spheres interact. One of the most sort of pressing and dire and dramatic examples of three spheres interacting right now is human beings, part of the biosphere, extracting fossil fuels from the lithosphere that formed millions of years ago from organisms that were part of the biosphere, and we're burning them and pumping sort of the waste product into the atmosphere. And all of those things are leading to deleterious and negative interactions with all the spheres, like the melting of ice, the pollution of water, all spheres sort of connected under that circumstances. And one last thing we need to remember is that, we're talking about ecosystems here, we're talking about ecology. And an ecosystem is more than just the biotic components of a given geographic area. It's all of the spheres interacting. An ecosystem exists because of those abiotic conditions. Climate, that's part of the atmosphere. Precipitation, part of the hydrosphere. Elevation, or rock type, or mineral type, or soil type, which is part of the lithosphere. So all of those things interacting sort of facilitate the development of ecosystems. An ecosystem is both the living and non-living components of a given geographic area. So elevation, temperature, precipitation, climate, latitude, not really longitude, but latitude for sure. All of those things factor into why certain ecosystems exist in certain ways. For example, where I am now in the Bosque, this is a product of both climate, which is part of the atmosphere to some extent, the hydrosphere, the amount of water availability, and this ecosystem is actually changing dramatically as a result of the anthrosphere, the biosphere, through humans, messing with the hydrosphere and limiting the amount of water that can flow through this area. Go ahead and watch one of my virtual field trip videos for the Bosque. I'll link to it up above to get more information on that aspect. So let's briefly talk once again, and by briefly I mean probably much longer than is necessary, but that's how I do things. So let's look back at those three components that make life on Earth possible. Let's start with sunlight. Sunlight leaves the sun, hits the earth, hits a leaf. The leaf photosynthesizes, converts that sunlight and carbon dioxide plus water into glucose and oxygen. That's what photosynthesis is. We'll probably learn more about that later. And now what happens there is we have high quality energy, what's referred to as high quality energy from the sun. It hits the earth, highly energetic, lots of potential there, and it's sort of transferred into low quality energy as it moves through ecosystems and as it leaves the earth eventually as heat or as infrared radiation. So hits the earth as high quality energy, passes through ecosystems, is stored potentially over millions of years as oil or natural gas or coal, and then is eventually released and converted into low quality energy, either heat energy, or when we burn fossil fuels, that's also a form of sort of low quality energy. That's why solar has such huge potential as an energy resource. So the other second component is the cycling of nutrients through the Earth systems. This involves things like the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the sulfur cycle. We're mostly going to be focusing on the hydrologic cycle, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle, but this movement and transfer and transfiguration and these changes that occur within ecosystems, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere, and how materials and matter and energy move throughout them is a really important component of what allows life to exist on Earth. And then, like I said, gravity. Obviously, gravity is a pretty important component in the universe. It's one of the four fundamental forces, and it's what allows the atmosphere to be denser at the surface of the Earth and not float away, and allows us to breathe nourishing oxygen and do all the things that we do here on the surface. So here we have a sort of rundown of how those photons of solar energy interact with and move throughout the Earth system. They enter the Earth through the atmosphere. Much of it is absorbed by the Earth, but a lot of it is actually reflected back into space by the atmosphere. Then we have whatever enters the atmosphere hits the Earth's surface in the form of high energy radiation, very often ultraviolet and sort of in that general range. A lot of it's absorbed by the Earth and the biosphere and the things that are happening on the Earth: photosynthesis, organisms, ecosystems, soil, rock, and so on. And then it's often sort of reflected back from the Earth, or at least radiated back from the Earth. Not really reflected, but radiated back from the Earth in the form of sort of lower energy, lower wavelength infrared or heat radiation. Much of that leaves the atmosphere, but most of it sort of sticks around and is what sort of provides warmth and comfort here on the Earth's surface. And, you know, as you can see, and as I'm probably sure you are familiar with, we're doing things to the planet that help the planet hold on to a lot of that radiation. Greenhouse gases in the forms of methane and water vapor and carbon dioxide. These things are being pumped into the atmosphere at higher levels than is natural or normal, at least in the short term. And that sort of creates this blanket of these gases around the Earth's atmosphere. And much of that infrared radiation that should or would normally be leaving the Earth system and back into space is sticking around and is heating up the oceans, heating up the atmosphere, melting glaciers, changing precipitation patterns, and so on. So, what are the major components of an ecosystem? Well, there are three listed here. We have autotrophs in the form of plants, as you can see all around me. These are the photosynthesizers. These aren't just plants. Most of the photosynthesis that occurs on the Earth is actually happening in the oceans with sort of single-celled cyanobacteria, photosynthetic microorganisms, things like that. But they're the autotrophs, the ones that produce their own energy, and they form the foundational level of all food chains and food webs on this planet, and they're an essential component to the Earth life support system. Then we have heterotrophs, those things that eat autotrophs or eat things that eat autotrophs. So consumers, often referred to as consumers. This is you and me. These are herbivores, omnivores, other things like that. And then we also have the decomposers, those things that break down dead material, dead plant material, dead animal material, and the decomposers and the detritivores are often sort of lumped together, even though they do very different jobs. Detritivores sort of break down dead material. These are things like mushrooms and vultures and ants and things that break large carcasses and detritus into smaller pieces, and then the decomposers, very often bacteria or fungi, break it down and turn it into essentially nutrients, soil nutrients for things like that. So those are the main components of an ecosystem. So we've been talking about what an ecosystem is, but what exactly does an ecologist study? Well, they study that, ecosystems. They study how these things function, the relationship between the living and non-living, or biotic and abiotic components of a given geographic area. And they study the different sort of levels of organization within an ecosystem, all the way from organism to ecosystem itself. And ecologists study ecosystems at basically every level that exists within those ecosystems, from the organism level, or the individual species, all the way up through the biosphere as a whole. Now, I would argue that most ecologists stay sort of lower in that hierarchy, organisms, populations, and communities, but they do extend well beyond that in terms of what they study and how they try to understand their surroundings and the surroundings in which they do their research. So let's start at the bottom, the organism, the individual species. So for example, the cottonwood tree behind me across the river. Then you look at the population, so all the cottonwoods in the bosque, and that's the population of cottonwoods. If you're looking at the community ecology, then you're looking at how the cottonwood sort of interacts with plants and animals in its surroundings. So for example, what animals roost or feed on cottonwoods, like beavers or birds, and how the cottonwood is this sort of apex species, this keystone species within the area. Moving beyond that and adding in those factors that are both living and non-living, you have the ecosystem or ecology level. Once again, we discussed that quite extensively, but it's looking at all the biotic and abiotic components of a given geographic area and how they interact to sort of create the identity of that area. Beyond that, you have the biosphere, all living things on this planet. And then on this next slide, we can sort of see how all of those things interact and move throughout an ecosystem, how nutrients in the form of matter and energy move within and beyond and throughout the ecosystem, moving from the producers to the consumers to the predators, and then back into the system through decomposition and the detritivores, and how all that sort of works together. And obviously if something else comes in from the outside, like an invasive species or pollution or a lack of water because of human activity, it throws everything out of whack. It throws everything into chaos, which is what we have really globally right now. We are a species that is influencing every aspect of the biosphere, of the Earth system, and that's not good. And we're going to learn more about the ramifications of that this year. All right, let's look back at these living components of an ecosystem and how they sort of function just briefly. So we have our producers, our autotrophs. These are the ones that photosynthesize. They form that sort of base level of any ecosystem. Without these, you don't really have anything. You don't have really much going on. Above that, we have our heterotrophs, our consumers, and these exist in multiple levels. So we have our primary consumers. Those are the herbivores, things like rodents and deer and whatnot. And then as you move up the levels, those different primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary consumers are based on sort of who eats who. So we have the primary consumers on the bottom. Those are the herbivores. The things that eat herbivores, those are secondary consumers. The things that eat herbivores, those are the tertiary consumers, and so on. And you get up eventually to like the apex predator in a given ecosystem. Now, you don't really need to know all these different levels and how they interact, but one thing you should be aware of is the concept of biomass, and the idea that most of the biomass exists at that sort of autotroph level. So biomass is the amount of living matter within a given area, within an ecosystem. And if you look around, just look behind me right now, look around any given area, most of what you see is going to be plants if you're in an ecosystem. At least most of the living components of any ecosystem are going to be plant-based. Then as you move up, the amount of biomass that exists diminishes, because as an animal consumes an autotroph, that primary consumer, a lot of that mass that goes into their body to help build their biomass is released as waste. But anyway, this concept of biomass, the living material within an ecosystem, as you move up through those levels, mass and the amount of energy that is transferred through the consumption of that mass, through eating, is diminished by about 90% each time. So you might eat a certain amount of food, or an organism might eat a certain amount of food, but only about 10% of that energy is transferred from one level to the next level. And that's sort of that, energy hierarchy as well. So it's not super efficient, but it gets the job done, obviously, because we live in a world with a lot of ecosystems. So when it comes to like productivity in terms of how much biomass and energy can be produced by any specific type of ecosystem, swamps are actually the most successful, the most proficient at being productive when it comes to being an ecosystem and producing lots of biomass and lots of energy. So you might think something like a rainforest, but actually a swamp is, as ecosystems go, is the most productive when it comes to this concept of net primary productivity, the amount of energy and matter produced that is in surplus in a given area. Here we see an example of a consumer, obviously. This is a lion eating the face off of a zebra. It's always fun. And next we have the sort of lower levels, but exceptionally important, arguably the most important components of an ecosystem are the detritivores, or the decomposers. These are the things that break material down and recycle energy and matter into that ecosystem. This is what creates soil, and without soil you don't have a lot of those producers. You don't have those trees and the plants and the material that is food for all the other organisms. So we may not like to think about mushrooms and earthworms and beetles that eat carrion and eat dead things as being super important, but they are, without them we would just have corpses everywhere. We would just have carcasses of trees and carcasses of animals all over the place. So these detritivores, these decomposers, the decomposers are the ones that release the nutrients back into the ecosystem, and the detritivores are the ones that sort of break things down into smaller and smaller scales, increase that surface area, and allows the decomposers to sort of do their work. There's not much waste, as you can see. Like, if you look around, there's not a lot of waste out there. Some areas, like if you come down to the bosque, you'll see there's a lot of leaf litter, a lot of plant matter, a lot of tree branches on the ground. That's because this ecosystem is broken, it's damaged. Those processes that allow the detritivores and the decomposers to do their work are gone because we've limited the amount of water that can enter the system. So if there were regular floods throughout this region, we would have a very different ecosystem, and the decomposition process would be much, much quicker. But obviously those things aren't happening right now. Lastly, here we go, some examples of decomposers and detritivores, mushrooms, fungus, vultures, so on and so forth. So that wraps up part 1 of chapter 3. We're going to be talking about the biogeochemical cycles that are of most importance, nitrogen cycle, water cycle, and carbon cycle in our next video. So take good notes, listen to what I say. I gave you a lot of answers in this lecture on the chapter 3 assessment, the chapter 3 quiz. So make sure you watch it again and get good notes. Thank you.